In all the religions that I've studied through the years, I've never seen anything come close to what we have in Christ. Sometimes what bothers me the most is that we don't understand how great Jesus is and all that he's done for us. And so I hope the focus is on that as we go along today. Now, my name is Jim Bjornstad, and my topic today is from Walla Martin to EMNR to today, and the good and the not so good. The conference has the theme of on leaving a legacy, and so to have that, you have to have someone old. You also have to have someone that was here, and so I become both of those. I have a coach at the college at Cedarville, soccer coach. I thought he was older than I was, and I call him Methuselah. And I did that long enough until last year I discovered that I was 6 years older than he was. And so he's the guy that came up with the idea of saying, yeah, there goes Bjornstad. He's so old that when God said, let there be light, he pulled a switch. And that's the comment that you get on that. I've also learned as I go along in philosophy that I get new definitions for things. Mind-body problem, I remember teaching that many, many, many years ago in basic problems in philosophy. And, is there an immaterial part to man and a material part to man, and how do they interact? Theologians don't talk about that, but philosophers do. And we used to say, is it interactionism? Is it occasional? Is it just parallel, like two ships passing in the night? What is it? But I discovered a new one as I get older, and the new one is this. My mind says, go ahead, you can do it. My body says, don't even think about it. And some of you probably, I think, would know what I'm talking about. And then the other indication while I was coming, and I was on Southwest Airlines coming out, and I had in line A27, so I'm on the front row there of the number of people coming in, and everyone in front of me took their cell phone and held it under the thing as a boarding pass until I got there and I had a paper copy. You can tell I'm getting older in the sense of all of this. And so, old, yes. I've been to every one of the annual meetings of EMNR except one when I had the flu. So I have the basis to go back to try to help you to realize this and what it's all about. And I hope I can do that. There's a lot of stuff here to cover. Now, I'm going to begin with Walla Martin because that's my beginning, and actually they call him the grandfather or the great-grandfather of all cult busters. And that certainly would fit Walter's title. Walter was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1928. I'm born in Brooklyn, New York in 1940. So we used to kid about our background as being from Brooklyn, New York. Martin founded Christian Research Institute in 1960. And I remember meeting him and Walla Bjork and Tony Colarilli and I think it was Bob Smith and then Everett Jacobson even, who was one of the original board members way back when, actually in 1964. That's as far back as I go. But after high school, I went to work with a defense contractor, and then in 1964, in January, I started at Northeastern Bible College. And while I was there, I met a girl right away, Becky Leonard. And our first date was on Valentine's Day of that year, and we were married in 1966, and Becky passed away in 2010. The importance of Becky is she was the babysitter for the Martins. And so she lived at their house on weekends. And so if I wanted to date her, I had to go up to the house there. And it was a little with tremor and fear as I thought about Walla Martin. But Walter is a gracious guy. He's a jovial guy. And we had a lot of fun through the years. To begin with, he started out on the Long John Neville show, and it was a secular program, one of the most popular in New York. Millions of people would listen to it. And he would be a regular guest on the program. And then after the program, he and Elaine and myself and Becky would go out, and we'd sometimes meet on one of the diners up on Route 23. When it comes to churches, I used to go to some of the churches with him, and as he would speak. And sometimes I hear today that people say, well, he's awfully rough in the churches and all the rest. I only know of one particular occasion, and I wasn't there at the time, but Walter Bjork was. And there was a time when Martin made the statement, "I'll sue you." And what happened is, it was Christian Scientists that were present. They were the Committee on Publication. Now, for those of you that know Christian Science, you know they're the cops, C-O-P-S. And they basically are there to see that you don't do any injustice to Mrs. Eddy. And so what happened is, as Martin was responding back to them, one of the guys said, "We'll sue you." And Martin says, "I'll sue you," in the heat of the moment. And so I wouldn't hold that as very much against them. I have had my own problems with the cops. I'll tell you what they're like. They come to a church, Calvary Bible Church in Derry, New Hampshire. And I'm there and I'm speaking on Christian Science. And afterward, well, in the beginning, I said, "I'd like to introduce you to some people that are here today. They're from the Mother Church in Boston, and they are the Committee on Publication." I said, "Now they're here to make sure that I don't say anything bad about Mrs. Eddy." Now I said, one of two things is going to happen. Either they're going to have the guts at the end of this meeting in the question and answer series to challenge and say things are wrong, or they're going to wait a week and they're going to write letters to the editor in a newspaper and tell you how I misaligned and said bad things about her and everything else. You want to know what happened? They never said a peep during a half-hour answer session. But sure enough, it came out in the newspaper how bad I was and what I said. And I remember all of the people there in the church writing in and sending letters to the editors saying, "I was there and he wasn't like that." But that's something of the way that it goes when you're speaking on cults. Thomas Altizer, I used to go to the debates with Walter too, and I remember in Stony Brook, that was quite a tough night. I mean, Martin just took him apart. And then I would get Christian people saying after me, "Oh, you know, he didn't treat him well. You know, that wasn't nice." And it was almost like Walter lost the debate by winning the debate. That's a strange thing, isn't it? But you know, I just want to explain to you a little bit about things like that. I remember years ago at Montclair State University, I was invited to speak about the Eastern religions to 3 classes, and basically I got a lot of students from the college that came, probably about 2,000 in the auditorium. And as I spoke, I did a great job. I put in juxtaposition to each other Eastern religions versus Christianity. And it really went great till we got to the end, and then the moderator said, "Are there any questions?" And I got this really smiley, happy, jovial fellow, little kid, and he's there in an orange saffron robe, little pigtail shaved head, and he gets up and he says, "I love you." We're really saying the same thing. I said, "I really love you too, but we're not saying the same thing." And I went on to describe the differences that there were between Christianity and what he believed. And I remember halfway through, he just turned around, stomped out of the place, slammed the door, and the moderator just simply said, "Well, you know, are there any other questions?" And we kept on. But when it was all finished, I had a number of Christian groups that came up to me and said, "You should be more loving." Now, I've thought about that, and it didn't take me long to think about it. I just simply said, what would the loving thing be? Would it be for me to tell them, just keep on believing what you believe, somehow, somewhere, sometime, you'll make it? Or if I really loved him and cared for him, would I take the time to share with him the gospel? It seems to me that if I really hated him, I wouldn't have said anything about difference. I'd just let him go his way and suffer in hell. But that's not what it's all about. And one of the toughest things that you have is trying to tell people at times or explain to them that they're wrong in what they believe. And they take offense to that. And so just in that sense there, the people just listening, well, you know, be nice to him. We weren't even at that time politically correct, actually. And yet here we have the problems of people saying you could be more loving, you could have been nicer to him, and all of the rest. Well, Walter took on the Bible Answer Man on Family Radio in 1965 and then tried to develop a computer base at that time of the best Christian literature available. We never really did complete that. But in 1967, 1972, I worked at Christian Research Institute, and that was during the time even when John Warwick Montgomery was there. Then I founded the Institute of Contemporary Christianity. I left in 1972. And that was not over any differences with Walter. It was basically to move on to even more or further, because I was more into world religions at that time than I was really the cults. And so it was to get a broader base as I went out, and so I'd sort of be the first organization that popped out from Walter's ministry. And then in 1974, he moved to the West Coast. When people say, well, what did you learn from Walter Martin? Well, a number of things. One of the things I learned from Walter was always to think things through, no reasons why. He'd ask me, what did you learn in class? I'd tell him. He said, explain it further. What about this? And then I always love the question that comes after the rational question of why. It's so what? What difference does it make? And I can remember the challenges that would come. And then something else that I always thought about is Walter would say, never be satisfied with where you are with knowledge. So an awful lot of people in life are like that. Can I give you a classic example this morning? I had a prophet, Briarcliff Manor at the King's College when I taught there. And I probably would have been in my 50s. He was about 80. He still had the original overheads he had, when he began. They were dark and brown and all the rest. I'm going to tell you what happened to Dr. Fry. I was teaching class at 8 o'clock in the morning, and here comes a student through my door. And he says, Bjornstad, come quick, come quick. I think Dr. Fry has died. I went into the classroom. He taught sitting down in the chair, facing them. And here was his head on the desk. And I shook him, and he turned his head up, and in one eye he looked at me, and his glasses were sort of bent. And he said, did I fall asleep? I said, you did? He had taught this stuff so long that he fell asleep teaching his own stuff. Now, when you get to that place that it becomes that boring, you're in trouble. And Martin would always say, learn more. Keep on going in the subjects that you have. Don't be satisfied just with what you have. And I know through the years that a lot of people have have tried to picture me as being in opposition to Martin. I think one of the cutest things came out in 2013, and I just have to tell you this. It's still on the internet. And if you were to go to the greatestdebate.wordpress, what do you think the greatest debate was? William Lane Craig? Hitchens? What would you think? Well, here's the name of it. Mormon Representatives Lawrence F. Flake and Dr. James Bjornstad versus Dr. Walter Martin. It took place on August 11, 2013. Unfortunately, Walter passed away in 1989. So I don't know how that took place. Must have been a seance or something that I missed. I've only had two mentors in life, and one was Walter Martin, and the other was Shiles Johnson. And Shiles, I always refer to him as being sanctified by degrees. We use that of John Warwick Montgomery because he has 7 earned degrees, 3 doctorates. But Shiles had 4 earned doctorates. And those are the two guys that I really credit an awful lot to. And simply to say today, I'm very much the product of Walter Martin in my thinking, and the way they'll say, yes, but what does the text say? That's the bottom line. So I'm still very much like him. But let me take you to a little bit further in this as we go along. The next step might be the beginning of the summit meetings and the beginning really of bringing groups together. And it took place in 1978 at Campus Crusade for Christ in Arrowhead Springs. At that summit meeting, Ron Enroth and I were present, as well as a number of others. And it was called by Pat Means, who was the U.S. director of Campus Crusade. And we were supposed to work together on projects. And it met the first year, then the second year, but we didn't do our work. And then Pat Means was called elsewhere. So as early as the late 1970s, we had the beginning part of EMNR. But it wasn't until 1982, in 1980 actually, Lausanne Conference, when Gordon Lewis came back from there, that we started the Evangelical Ministries at that time to cultists. And the original members were Gordon Lewis, Walla Martin, Ron Enroth, and myself. And then we changed the name in 1984 to Evangelical Ministries to New Religion. Well, channel a little bit further on, in 1979, mentioned the John Angerberg show. John Angerberg called me in 1979 and said, we're going to start a television program. This is the inauguration. And so I said, we're going to start a television program. Now, I don't know why he called me. I never got an explanation. I was in the debate team in high school. My earliest debate was in Sunday school. 8 years of age with my Sunday school teacher. I have to tell you about that. I'm Norwegian. I love Christmas. I like Christmas trees. My teacher didn't. He hated Christmas trees. And so he told me it was wrong to have a Christmas tree because pagans worshipped under every green tree. And I said to him, but an every green tree is not an evergreen tree. And so you know what happened when I got home from church. My dad, who was also an elder, said to me, I hear there was a ruckus in Sunday school today. I said, no ruckus, just a friendly disagreement. And I told him what happened. He laughed and he said, that's great. You know, if he does anything like that again, hit him again. I thought, oh, this is good. Okay, we'll keep at it. But on the first time we met with Al Metzger, Youth for Christ, Kansas City. We did 12 programs in 3 days. And we had Latter-day Saints, Jehovah's Witnesses, and astrologers in those programs. They're the original programs that were done. Now, when you go along with this, there's some interesting things that come out. In the Latter-day Saint one of the fellows there sort of got aggravated with me, and he started to raise his hand like this, making a fist. And what happens on the team is the other Mormon grabs his arm. So in 1980, I was at Grand Rapids Baptist College and Seminary, at Cornerstone now, and Luke Wilson called me on the phone from the Institute of Religious Research and said, hey, I got some Mormons coming. We're going to have lunch tomorrow. So I said, sure. So we had a bishop and a Melchizedek priest, and the Melchizedek priest said to me, he said, I want you to know, he said, I watched that tape. He said, and he said, I want you to know that I want to apologize for the Mormon church. You are far more Christian than we were. I never thought I'd hear a Mormon say that to anybody, but it did happen then. So don't think that people don't watch the tapes or watch what you do or how you act. Then the next one was, of course, the debate on baptism in 1982, appropriately named place the War Memorial Coliseum in Chattanooga, Tennessee. 4,500 people present, 4,300 Church of Christ. Interesting night. And the subject was, is baptism necessary for salvation? And it was David Kingdon, myself, and Jerry Jones and Jim Allen. And to be honest with you, when you go into debate like that, if you're really interacting with what they're saying and responding to what they're saying, you're lost in the debate. And I really didn't know till the end of the debate where it ended. I remember in the beginning of, before we started, the night before, D.A. Carson calling me and saying, now, Jim, whatever you do, don't get on those passages that they use. I said, Don, how are you ever going to avoid it? It's all I got. You know, if you think of necessary and sufficient, you say something is necessary, you have to have it in order to get this. And sufficient, if you have this, you got that. Well, what's necessary for salvation? Well, faith in Christ. What's sufficient? Faith in Christ. But the church says, no. What's necessary besides faith is baptism. And so we got on that subject. And right at the end, I got up and I was trying to think, what happened? I don't know if you've ever been at a place like that. And then the two opponents came over to me and said, we'd like a rematch. And then I figured I must have done better than they did. But I had one pastor came up to me and said, I have the quote here, there ought to be a special place in hell for people like you who so ably defend error. Says a lot. Now, you might ask the question, that was debate 2, wasn't it? Where was debate 1? Well, it took place the year before. And the person, Jerry Jones, was in that debate, as was Gordon Lewis. And Gordon Lewis did not do so well in the debate. And so the Church of Christ was pressuring John to put it on television, which he couldn't do. And so that's why we set up the second debate, so that we could do that. And I remember something I just want to share with you that Walter says about debaters. He says there are only 2 types of people to quicken the dead. Now, usually that's used of the living and the dead. But for Walter, it means you got to think quick, and you got to be able to respond. And if you can't do that in a debate like that, you can come out on the wrong end. And you know, for those of you that love debating and whatever, always understand this. If you lose, Christianity loses. It's a very important point. I mean, when you're out there representing the King of Kings, you better come through. And for me, it means I study as hard as I can, and then I commit it to Christ, and we go into the battle. But I don't take it lightly. I don't take it lightly. In my lifetime, I regret only one situation preaching in a church in Pennsylvania where I let the Mormon elders raise too many questions. And if I could redo it, I would have cut their time off much earlier. It's the only one I simply regret, and I rethink about it as I look at it. But let me go a little further. 1979, we're going to look at the Evangelical Writers Unification Church debate. And this took place June 8th to June 10th at the Unification Church's World Mission Center in Manhattan. This involves several people from EMNR, Brooks Alexander, myself, Ron Enroth, Jerry Yamamoto, puppet master, and Irving Hexam, who was not one of us, but they threw him in there for good measure. And then I required that they have someone there who represented and could speak for the church, and that was Neil Albert Salonen, the president, Holy Spirit Association of the Unification of World Christianity. And John Sabone from Union Theological Seminary, Warren Lewis, Unification Theological Seminary, Jonathan Wells, graduate of Unification Theological Seminary and at Yale University, and then Andrew Wilson, who was at Harvard Divinity School. And the convener was Richard Kabadow, if you remember him, the Young Evangelicals. Moderator was Rodney Savatsky, Sexton Cults. Kathy Lowry, Public Affairs for the church, and John Moust from Christianity Today. One of the most unusual discussions I had. And I just, let me tell you just a little bit about this. First of all, they paired us each night with one of the Unification people. So I got the teacher at the Unification Church. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, he said to me, you know, we're supposed to be here converting you. I said, well, you're not doing a good job. He said, you know a lot about the Unification Church. He said, did you know, and this is honest truth, 3 o'clock in the morning, he said, did you know that Sun Myung Moon's blood, some of his blood, was in the original wine used in the first blessing? I said, really? I said, do you have some proof of that? He says, yeah. He said, I got the original blessing. I'd love to have that. He said, well, I'll trade you for some stuff. It was interesting. Next morning, I'm sitting in the meeting, and Neil Albert Salone starts it off, and I said, I got a question, Neil. I want you to tell me about this. And he said, well, how do you know about that? I said, well, it's in the first edition of the first blessing, isn't it? And man alive, he was just blown away, and it really, really hurt them in this. But here was their tact. I just want you to listen to this. They said, I want you to know now, you know, we come from Korea to America, and our theology now is changing. And here's the quote. Who knows? It might even become evangelical Christianity one day. Believe that? Well, they started to talk a little bit, and they said, well, we're looking at the how many years, in the creation and whatever. And I'm saying, look, stop with the small stuff. Here's what I want to know. You say that Jesus failed in his mission. You say Sun Myung Moon is the Messiah. Okay. Can that change? Can you say that Jesus Christ was successful in his mission? Can you say that Sun Myung Moon is not the Messiah? They said, absolutely not. I said, then you'll never become Christian. Don't start with the piddly stuff. Give me basically the non-negotiables of the Christian faith. Can you change your understanding of God when you say that God is energy and the creation basically is the body of God? Can you change that to say God is personal? Absolutely not. So where do we go from there? Well, John Moust in his notes wrote this at the end for Christianity Today. Unification theology may give the appearance of being open in a state of change and development. But by the end of the dialogue, it was clear that all that were areas which were unchangeable, that there were areas that were unchangeable, and that unification theology was not going to become Christian theology. Christianity Today say, just soften that up a little bit in the end there. There's always the possibility that there could be a mass conversion that takes place. Okay, have it your way. What really bothered me is that some years later, Jerry Falwell defended the Unification Church and actually became a speaker for their family conferences. And the only way I could offset that was to use an old warhorse in the Southern Baptist Convention to go talk to Jerry, and we were able to correct some of that. Witness Lee, next one. Let's just get into all of this. Counterfeits at Your Door, when I did the book, there was a page in which I mentioned Witness Lee, and I was under fire. And in 1978, they sent Bill Freeman out to Bend, Oregon to meet me at a restaurant. And he brought all this history stuff on mingling and everything with. And the year after, I was visited by leaders from Texas and California. But in 1980, Witness Lee, Bill Freeman, the church in Anaheim filed suit against Neil Duddy, Spiritual Counterfeits, and Scherwenliger Verlag, German publisher. And it was tough. 1984, we were in court, Superior Court in California. And I was the expert witness for the Unification Church. It was tough. They asked me about sources. I had over 125 sources, including the Chinese texts from China before they came to the United States that were translated into English. And so it was interesting to see their faces on the number of documents that I had. But there were some interesting questions I just thought that I would tell you. Duddy called Witness Lee a spiritual pygmy. He shouldn't, I don't think he should have done that. He says, well, he said, after all, he says, wasn't it B.B. Warfield that used that? Yeah, I said, but you still shouldn't have used it. But anyway, here's one of the questions I got. Do you think you know the Bible better than Witness Lee? Watch out how you answer a question like that. I said, yes, I do, simply because I've been formally trained. That's not to say that Witness Lee does not know the Bible well. I'm simply saying that I am more equipped with regard to the text and to understand it because I understand the original languages and I've been trained. Now, it was interesting that afterward one of their lawyers came over and said that was a very gracious answer. I thought it was too because I should have said, yes, I do, but I didn't in that. But then just for your own humor in this, I have to tell you one other thing that happened in that Bill Freeman, and I do believe Bill is a born-again Christian, was telling in court under oath, and he was telling about his conversion to Christ. And he said, I sat in the camp one day. It's when he came to Christ. He said, he said, right in front of the fire that night, he said, I was burning faggots. And the judge said, "What was that?" Now you all understand faggot has a different meaning, I hope. Okay. Well, a faggot basically, Bill says, he said we used to write our sins on a piece of paper, put them on a stick, and burn them in the fire. That was a faggot. So we found out interesting things as we went along. But what happened finally is SCP ran out of money, and the court awarded the local church $11.9 million in damages. But then it wasn't too far later, 1999, and John Ankerberg, John Weldon, chapter on local churches and living stream ministry in the Encyclopedia Cults and New Religions. Here we go. So, 2001, December 14th, Harvest House sues the church in Fullerton for harassment, keeping after them. A couple of weeks later, the 99 local churches and the Living Stream Ministry sued the authors and Harvest House. And this became now the test. And it was interesting as it began in this. I talked with J. Gordon Melton, after the time when SCP ran out of money and everything. And he knows basically where they are. I mean, we talked back and forth about this. Of course, they finished the court case. I was never asked to come or whatever. But in this one here, this was an interesting one. I find the amicus brief right away on behalf of Harvest House and the two Johns. And the trial court at first simply wanted the jury to decide it, wanted the jury trial. And then what happened is they filed it with the Court of Appeals, and they reversed that decision. They said, you don't need that. There's no basis to go further. And twice the Supreme Court in Texas refused to review the appeal. So it went to the Supreme Court in 2007. A lot of you filed amicus briefs with this, which were helpful. And the United States Supreme Court refused to review the appeal. And so John Ankerberg, John Weldon, and Harvest House won at that point. Now, 2009, we have divisions within EMNR, differences. Christian Research Institute dedicated an issue on this controversy, and there was Hank Hanegraaff that wrote the statement that summarizes it. The result of our primary research is encapsulated in the following three words: we were wrong. And this was followed by articles by Elliot Miller and Gretchen Pasentino. I appreciated what Eric Piment has given on our website about Elliot Miller. These are all friends of mine. I disagree with them. I don't agree with what they wrote in that or whatever. But sometimes we have a problem being friends with someone who disagrees with us. And we've had some histories of that in EMNR all the way through. But let me go a little bit further and tell you some other things. Early 1980s, we got into Great Britain. Ken Frampton had two sons that joined the Children of God. He had an organization called Deo Gloria Trust, and he invited Brooks Alexander and I to come out. In the first conference we had, it was an interesting conference, and in that we had a lot of different topics, and we were working with people in the place in Europe, but different countries came. And I did an off-the-cuff session on Scientology. Now, when we came back the year after, what was interesting is that the Alliance missionary, the Alliance, Evangelical Alliance ministry, came to us and said, we have this document here about what you said last year. And he said, you really said bad things about Scientology. And so I looked at the paper and I said, I didn't say this. And so the question came up, well, if you didn't say this. And so then next thing to this is one of the ministers had a set of tapes from the year before. And so what they did is they all went in a room and they played the tape. And they found out that what they had on the sheet of paper that was given to them was totally rewritten and false. It was not what I said at the conference. The question then came up is, okay, how did we get this? And the minister, the head said, well, it was on my desk when I came in. So then they went to the janitor and they said, did anyone come in here in the morning? And he said, yeah, the minister of Scientology. How tricky they work and how interesting. Scientology was in trouble with the Evangelical Alliance ministry because of the types of things that they do. It's even worse than Ron Enroth, where we have Scientologists in monkey suits outside making fun of whatever it was that he was speaking on. And Brooks also, by the way, gave a presentation to the British Parliament at that time on transcendental meditation. 1982, around that time, Maranatha Campus Ministries. Oh my goodness. I guess they're still around now in Arizona, but different leadership. Well, these people would say, change the world, change the world, change the campus, change the world. That was their theme. And I used to hear the full gospel businessmen call them the Green Berets for Christ. I was very disappointed. Their basic structure was pastors, and then you have shepherds over each individual person, sheep. And then every aspect of a person's life, even the smallest personal details, is under submission to the shepherd, ultimately to the pastor. You disobey the pastor, you disobey God. Now, there was a lot of stuff that was going on at this time. We had some people who couldn't even raise themselves high enough in the church that they committed suicide because they were failing God. In failing the pastor, you failed God. We had people who would say to us, you know, my mother and father wanted us to have a child, and we went to the pastor, and he said, well, it's not time yet for you to have a child. The people who wanted to go to college, no, we don't want you to go to college. You know, why don't you contribute your money to our organization? And so in 1982, Maranatha Campus Ministries asked Christian Research Institute for a letter of endorsement. CRI decided not to do that, and instead they formed a committee. We met with the leadership in Santa Barbara and formed the committee. It was myself, Ron Enroth, Gordon, Steve Cannon, and Karen Hoyt of SCP, and then also Brian Onken of CRI. And it's an interesting group. They had no doctrinal statement, no financial statement. They had Bible studies, but they were really poorly interpreted. And they had total control over the people. Now, they did rework some of the literature. Here's how bad it was. In the opening meeting, I was the chair of the meeting. And I remember the first question I said, I'm just curious, you don't have a doctrinal statement. I said to Joe Smith, now this is not Joseph Smith and the Mormons. Joe Smith, how do you see God? He said, there's one God, one person, and he functions as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. I said, Apostle Bob Weiner, what do you think God is? He said, God is three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. I said, you know, you guys can't even agree. The top two guys can't agree on who the leadership is or what God is all about. They can't even come up with an understanding of God that agrees. And you expect the people in the church to do this? And so it just deteriorated in a sense. And what happened in it was not as good. Rose Weiner got a vision. We were all under, get this, the spirit of deception. So we were all just written off. And what happened is we went ahead and we did the report that you've probably seen in Christianity Today and elsewhere. And I remember when a person, one of the leaders down in Washington, D.C. area, came up the day that I released it. And here's what he said to me. He said, I want you to know that my heart is right before God. I told him at that time, I said, I'm not in the business of judging hearts. I judge actions. I judge what you do. And then the last statement he made to me as he walked out the door was this. If you were alive when Jesus was on earth, you would have been one of those that crucified him. Never forgot that. I said, I don't think so. He said, I do. I said, I know Jesus could know, you know, like in Matthew 11, when he said if the miracles that were done here, they would have repented. But I don't think you had that knowledge or anything. unless you claim to be God. But very interesting, the approach that they take instead of with all the stuff that we did to try to help them, they just simply denied it. Well, coming to a conclusion, we've had meetings at a lot of different churches. Calvary Chapels have been one of the favorite. We've been to a number of colleges, Southeastern Bible College, Biola, seminaries, there are a lot of them. Beeson Divinity School, Denver Theological Seminary, Midwest Baptist Theological Seminary, New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary, Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and Talbot Seminary. Now, we've had groups in to do dialogue with. We've had Joseph Takak, Worldwide Church of God. We also had some members of Farrakhan's Nation of Islam in at one time to dialogue with them. But we've had a lot of stressful times, too, I would like to mention. And some of these are problems that are hard, really, to deal with. From the beginning, when we started, all four of us, that was Gordon, Ron, Walter, and myself, wanted to bring all of the different peoples together. We also wanted to include many disciplines because we wanted to come on the problems that we had from all the perspectives. But it's hard to do that. And one of the hardest problems we had is simply with the academic people and the mom and pop shops. Just a difficult thing. We've had academics people that are professors who have come, and then what happens basically is they don't come after a while because we have people who are in small little ministries, and it was more important to do the academic realm than it was the other. I'm very sorry for that. Actually, there isn't any reason why we can't learn from each other. The guys that sit in ivory towers, now I'm not saying that I'm that or that we were that, need to learn from the people who are in the streets. And so really both need to come together. And then the problems we had with the people that were in certain disciplines. I'm on the board of Wellspring, and Paul Martin, for instance, the director, psychologist, looked down on. Ron Enroth, sociology sometimes. Why do we have somebody like that? People like Bob Pardon, who deals with reclaiming people. And I can even remember one of our guys, well-known guy in our midst, saying, "You don't need all that stuff. All you need to do is have them come to Christ. It all straighten out in one moment." Hey, folks, I don't know about you, but even in the church, we have problems who have been involved, people with drugs. And it takes us sometimes a long haul to bring them out. And we have people who have been involved in prostitution and pornography and all the rest, and it takes a process to get them out. And I'm going to tell you that there are people in the church even who have gone through spiritual abuse and cults that have gone through that need to be worked through to come out as well. It is not easy for a person who has been under the control of a cult member for years to ever trust the pastor again. It's difficult. We need each other in terms of dealing with things. And then there is some of the infighting. There was a big battle between Bill Elnor and Elliot Miller. And I remember to settle that, I had to make an agreement with Walter. I said, "Walter, if you'll pay for Elliot Miller's transportation from California to Philadelphia, I will come on Thanksgiving." My wife about killed me. "And we will meet." And we met all day long and resolved absolutely nothing. Bob Morey, Rick Ross was another, resolved nothing. We try even to help when there's infighting within EMNR. Some of the recent activities you've been on these programs, Jim Jones, David Koresh. I've even had a couple of interesting ones in the Jehovah's Witnesses lately. I was in a court case where I was asked to come by an attorney who said, "I'll pay you." And I said, "What for?" He said, "I want you to come in here and explain to the judge that the Assembly of God is not a cult. Here's the the wife has become a Jehovah's Witness and wants her husband to become a Jehovah's Witness. So the wife tells the judge that her husband's in a cult because he's a member, he's been saved, and he's a member of the Assembly of God. So I went down to the court case in Westchester County in New York, and the judge spoke to me for a while and said, I'll take him as an expert testimony. And so the case went in his favor. Lost his wife in it as well. And then the other one I had is where the wife becomes a Jehovah's Witness and is trying to convert her husband. And so in the process, she brings all the Jehovah's Witnesses over when they have regional meetings and whatever, and has them in the house and tries to convert them and all the rest. And finally the wife is told to divorce her husband. They're in court case now for divorce. I went in with the husband, and the judge said, what would you think of this? I said, I know cases where someone in the watchtower has told either the man or the woman to divorce their husband because they're not converting to Jehovah's Witness. That was a bad day for the Jehovah's Witness because they put the congregation overseer on trial. And they asked him point blank, did he say that? And he said yes. And you know what happened? They had to go to counseling for 2 months, but they could not use any Jehovah's Witness counsel. They could only use an evangelical Christian counselor, which I thought was funny. I didn't think I'd ever hear a judge say something like that. But there's so much in this of late. Paul Martin in Wellspring years ago with Rick Ross did something on Nexium. If you've watched Daily Mail or some of the latest television programs, you know that Nexium has been on frequently because of abuse of women. But I had to, as president of the board of Wellspring, I had to explain to a bunch of lawyers why Wellspring should not be sued. We had an agreement whereby Walter and I worked it out that when he was going to do something like this, he could write something on his own and it would not be part of Wellspring. And that's what he did. And so we were able to escape that. And then, of course, we've lost some outside of evangelical Christianity, Frank Beckwith, Roman Catholic, Hank Hanegraaff, Eastern Orthodox. I would just summarize it in this way, that through the years, whether corporately together, a group of members, or one of our member groups, or as individuals, EMNR has provided information, counsel, and help, even rescue, to those afflicted by religious movements, including abusive Christian groups. And that's the legacy that you carry on when you go forth from this conference as part of EMNR. It's concerned that it's working together as a family to accomplish things. And it's difficult to do because we're all individuals. It's a tough thing to do. But you know, we've tried from the beginning to try to bring that organization to that. And I look sometimes at all the member groups that were there in 1984. I don't see many of them today, but there are a lot of new groups today. And so people have come and gone, but the ministry still continues. And I want to invite you just to be a part of that and to continue to help us as we go forward. Now, I'm not sure how much longer I last in all of this. I'm on the program committee for next year. They have a lot of faith in me. And so anyway, if you have any questions or want to talk about any of those things, I'd be glad to do that any time during the conference. But I do want to thank you for your interest in EMNR and for coming to this conference today. And I do hope that we see each other next year. That is, you be here and me too. Okay? Take care. God bless.
All right. How are we doing on the time? What time does the breakout sessions, do the workshops start? 3:30, okay, so we do have time for some Q&A. Tonight we will have mics in both aisles, but right now we only have one in one. Yeah, thank you, Will. It was kind of set at Goliath height there for a minute. But if you have questions that you'd like to ask Jim, then I'm sorry you got all the way down and comfortable, but you can come to the microphone and ask your question. So, and if you don't, then we'll just go to the coffee shop, I guess. But speak up.
Come on up. They wanted in the microphone recorded.
Yes, sir. I'd just like to ask your opinion, maybe give some background on Hank Hanegraaff and the Christian Research Institute.
At present?
Yes, sir, and your past experiences too. But, I mean, and of course in a consolidated way.
I give you a little bit of background of myself and Hank, and then bring you up to that. When Walter died back in 1889, sometime later I was out in a conference in California, and Salem Communications called me up on the phone and asked me if I would do the Bible Answer Man program. I had done it before in New Jersey when I was back at that time. So did Walter Bjork. So we were familiar with taking his Bible classes when he couldn't make it, and we were familiar with doing the program when he couldn't make it either. And so it was very easy to do, and one of the things, of course, that came out of that was that I would do what Walter would do, is just take a Bible and sit there. So Salem talked to me about the possibility of doing some of those programs, and then Hank contacted me. So that's the first time that I think I really met Hank, where I had a conversation. I did see him at a Calvary Chapel conference years before that, but really didn't get to talk to him. But on that, I got to know him, became friends, still friends with him. I disagree with his movement that he has made to the Eastern Orthodox Church. Somehow in that, when you make that movement, there is something of a denunciation of what you have previously. And I'm not sure, he has not explained to any of us that I know of exactly where he is theologically in all of that. But I'm assuming that as becoming a part of that church and the steps he goes through, that is a change from evangelical Christianity, much as I know. David.
I have a follow-up question that relates to Hank Hanegraaff and him becoming the Bible Answer Man. He was a business manager, correct? When Walter was alive, he served in the business administrative side of the organization. And becoming the Bible Answer Man, what would his theological background be that would qualify? I mean, those are big shoes to fill, in my opinion, to have that level of Bible knowledge and be called the Bible Answer Man. I'm just curious what his education was and how did he qualify for a position like that?
That's a big question that has been asked about the succession there when Walter died. In my own way of looking at it, if I were looking at it from Walter's eyes, I would not have, and I say this personally, this is not anybody else, but I would not have chosen the way that he did. There were other people that were out there that I thought could have done better. I did have a conversation with Tony Colorilli. Somebody called me up and asked me if I knew Mr. Colorile, but that's never the name. That wasn't the way that we pronounced his name. It was Colorilli. And Tony said, well, Doc, that's what he always called Walter. He just, I can't see how he did this. And I said, well, I can't either. But as far as I can tell from all of the evidence and whatever, and I don't know all of it, there seems to be two sides. It seems that this was the decision that he made, as best as I can tell. And his reasoning for it has probably gone to the grave, because I won't be able to ask. And I don't intend to ask him when I get the glory, because there's far greater things to enjoy up there than that. So, so that's as much really as I know. It is not, and honestly, it was not the decision that I would have made. There were others that Walter had talked to that probably would have been better. But that whole thing as to what happened, was there a slip of paper? I've heard John Ankerberg, I've heard others. I really don't know the final conclusion to it. And so what is. Now the real question now is whether Hank should really continue as Bible answer man. And that I would say he shouldn't. Yeah.
You've spoken a lot about the legacy and the history. I'm going to ask you to go the other direction. For those of us who are still in the countercult ministry, what would you encourage us for the future?
I would encourage you to continue on in ministry and to use the best tools that you have available, or a lot of new ones from when I began. I would also encourage you to work together and to continue EMNR, to make it larger, and to work with each other and to help. If someone has something, there's no reason why we can't learn from other people, or even with credit given to use materials that others have and have made ready. But there's a lot to that. I think even so, when you think of the passages that we use, for instance, in your case with Jehovah's Witnesses, I think there's much to be learned from people who look at the psychological, sociological impact that is there with regard to people. I mean, I know what some of them go through when they try to leave. I know the pressures that are put on them, because I've talked to people inside. And I think you have to recognize all of that in this. You have to recognize the times that it can cost a marriage in some of this, because they're not going to give up in what they do. But I'm always looking for a better mousetrap. You know, I know all the passages and everything. The biggest one I have, and I've sort of raised some questions with you yesterday a little bit about it, but the biggest question that people like in my church have is, when someone comes to my house, you know, or I meet one on the street, what can I say in 30 seconds to get them interested in what I have? And I'm always interested in trying to find out some better ways. We talked a lot about discipleship in the earlier session, the summit meeting. One of the big things, I think, we're getting heavy to the fact of the church being a family and whatever, but there's also an institution that God formed before that, and that's the family itself. But I think within the church, sometimes when we get into caring about each other and loving each other and all the rest, we forget about people outside. And so evangelism suffers in that. And I think more and more in the church, we need to think back about the fact that we're to be witnesses. And witnesses doesn't start in Acts chapter 13 with the calling of Paul and Barnabas. It begins back there in Acts chapter 1 in verse 8, and it talks about starting in Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and then the uttermost parts of the earth. But all of that is included. So for me, discipleship begins with the beginning point of coming to Christ. And that's the area that we have to focus on. And it's not as easy today as it used to be to try to corral some of these people and get them to sit down. I meet them in the grocery store. We say hi, and I'll say, hey, I got a new passage for you. I don't want to hear it. I mean, it's gotten to that sometimes. I had a Mormon bishop the other day with two Mormon missionaries say, don't go near that guy. Whatever you do, don't talk to him. I said, what, I got leprosy? You know, what do you mean you don't want to talk to me? So it's getting harder and harder. I think we need each other. We need to pray for each other, hold each other's ministries up in prayer. I think all of that is part of it. But there are new ways. I think there's a lot more we can do on the internet. And just have to see how that goes, yeah. As you gather from my paper boarding pass, I'm not big on the internet. Anything else? It's good, thanks.